It's my pleasure to introduce James Serpell, who is a professor of animal welfare in the vet school at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the director of the Center for the Interaction of Animals in Society. Early morning. His research focuses on the behavior of welfare in cats and dogs. So when we do dogs next year, I hope we can bring you back. The development of human attitudes towards animals, the history of the impact on human-animal relationships. So he is, at heart, an anthrozoologist, I think. In addition to publishing more than 100 articles and book chapters, he is the author of very seminal books, including Animals in Human Society, The Domestic Dog, and The Company of Animals, Companion Animals, and Us. Dr. James Serpell.
Thank you. And thank you so much to the organizers of this conference, to Mike and to Al and Nora Gress for making it possible for me to come here. I was saying actually to Mike last night that I think this is a very timely conference. I think cats are the new dogs. They're becoming a big topic both in the animal welfare circles and elsewhere in the human-animal interaction area as well. So I think this conference is a very timely one. Okay, just to kind of ram home that point, if you like, some figures, recent figures on U.S. pet populations, and you can see that the cat's well ahead of the dog now, 88 million cats versus 75 million dogs. The dogs seem to be more spread out over a larger number of homes. That's because many cat households are multiple cat households. In fact, most cat households are multiple cat households. But both dogs and cats are still well ahead of other contenders, such as pet birds and things like that. This switchover from dogs being the most popular to cats being the most popular took place in 1985. And I don't know why especially, but I imagine it reflects changes in people's working lives, more people being out during the day and not being able to deal with a dog, and switching to cats because cats are more amenable to that kind of lifestyle change. In this talk, I want to really talk about how we got to this point where cats have become sort of overwhelmingly popular, at least in Western countries and increasingly in Asian countries as well. So where did cats come from? We talked about that a bit yesterday, and I won't dwell too long on that. When and why and how were they domesticated, which is an interesting story. I also want to go in some detail into the role that ancient Egypt played in the domestication of the cat, and then talk about subsequent historical changes in our attitudes to cats and our relationships with them. So where did the cat come from? Warren Johnson talked about this yesterday. We know that the ancestor of the cat was probably Felis sylvestris libica, the Asian or North African wildcat. We know that these cats lived all around this region, around the Mediterranean basin, the Levant, the Fertile Crescent. What's kind of interesting is that what we do know is that there were no cats on this island, Cyprus, until people brought them there. So there have been some interesting archaeological excavations on the island of Cyprus, excavations in the very earliest human settlements there. And in the course of those excavations, they found cat remains buried with people in human graves. And some of those remains are extremely old. So 9,500 years ago, this little mandible was found at a site called Kirakitia, shows those nice carnassial shearing teeth on the jaw, typical of cats. There are no cats on Cyprus earlier than this. And so the theory is that those cats were brought by the first human settlers from the Levant, probably, or possibly from southern Anatolia, from Turkey. So Cyprus is about 60 to 80 kilometers from the mainland. That's a long distance for a cat to travel on its own. The assumption must be that people were taking cats on boats with them to Cyprus, and at this very early date. And that suggests that people had already established a fairly close relationship with these animals by that point. and the fact also that they were burying cats in their graves suggests they had a fairly strong attachment for the animals as well. Now, on the issue of how cats were domesticated and why they were domesticated, I often refer back to this famous Rudyard Kipling story, The Cat Who Walked by Himself. For those of you who don't know the story, it's a kind of folktale type mythical account of how cats were domesticated. And here the cat tries to get into the cave where the first man and woman were living, and they say, no way, we don't want you in here, you're no value to us. And then a baby is born, and the cat sees his chance, and he comes in when the baby's crying, and he rubs himself against the baby and makes the baby laugh. And the woman blesses the cat. And at that point, the rawhide doorway of the cave falls down, and the cat gets into the cave. And then he does two more things. The last thing is that the woman gets frightened by a mouse, and the cat kills the mouse, and the woman finally succumbs to the cat's charms. But it's always seen as a kind of pact between the cat and the woman. And it's quite clear in the story that men and dogs are not included in this pact, and men and dogs will always persecute cats because this was a pact between cats and women. It's a Just So story. It came from a volume called the Just So Stories. And what's interesting about it is that it, again, portrays the cat as this individual who is very self-interested, isn't really interested in anything but the comforts of living with human beings. In other words, having a warm place by the fire, being able to get access to food when it wants. But it's not really that interested in people. It walks by itself, and it kind of gets in there by subterfuge. And a lot of the stories or the versions you hear nowadays about how cats were domesticated involves that element where the cat basically comes into human communities because it sees it as a source of food, a source of rodents, essentially. And humans kind of tolerate it. They don't like it very much, but they tolerate it, and then gradually through some kind of process of very slow assimilation, people get used to having cats around, and that results in a relationship developing between people and cats. Well, the first thing I want to say about that idea is that all putative accounts of how animals were domesticated are essentially Just So stories. None of us were there at the time. None of us really knows what happened. So we make up stories that explain what we think happened, but we don't really have any evidence because this type of evidence doesn't stay in the archaeological record. And the other thing I think it underestimates is the active role that humans played in bringing animals into their communities, even at a very early point in human history. The Hungarian archaeozoologist Sándor Bakonyi, back in 1969, said that domestication was really a two-stage process, and that the first stage involved people actually capturing and keeping animals, so bringing wild animals into the community and keeping them. And at that time, there was no real deliberate attempt to regulate their behavior or control their breeding. They're just catching wild animals, bringing them into the community, rearing them, and very often they run off or escape or die or whatever, but some of them survive. And then he goes on to the second stage, which is actual animal breeding, and that's where people start to take a kind of conscious role in selecting and regulating the breeding of animals and the feeding of animals and animal husbandry. In this first stage, you see very little divergence between these kept animals and their wild ancestors. Usually there's just a slight decrease in size. In the second stage, you start to see a lot of divergence as people select for particular types. Also, you see other things like animals suddenly appearing outside the geographic range of the ancestral species, and you see kind of artistic representations of animals living in very close association with people, and you see material objects associated with breeding and husbandry. But these are two distinct phases. Now the question is, could the cat have gone through this kind of early stage where people were actually capturing and keeping them? And interestingly, there's an early account by a Swiss explorer called Jörg Schweinfurt, who went into the Sudan in 1878. And he made this observation about the local people there, who frequently catch wildcats when they are kittens and have no difficulty reconciling them to life about their huts and enclosures, where they grow up and wage their natural warfare against the rats. So here we have people actively going out, catching little kittens and bringing them home, taming them, and then the cats start to wage their warfare against rodents. This is a description from 1968 of somebody who tamed wild cats in Rhodesia, I think. And it's just an amazing description of how affectionate these cats were. These cats never do anything by halves. For instance, when returning home after their day out, they are inclined to become super affectionate. When this happens, one might as well give up what one is doing, for they will walk all over the paper you were writing on, rubbing themselves against your face or hands, or they will jump up on your shoulder and insinuate themselves between your face and the book you were reading, roll on it, purring and stretching themselves, sometimes falling off in their enthusiasm, and in general demanding your undivided attention. So here we have a wild animal captured as a kitten, reared in a human household, behaving like a very, very affectionate domestic cat. If you look at some of the other wildcat species, like the European wildcat, Felis sylvestris, people have made many attempts to tame these cats from kittenhood. And all of those attempts have been largely unsuccessful because these northern European wildcats tend to be very fierce, very aggressive, very shy of humans. But that doesn't seem to be the case with the Felis sylvestris libica. And also this habit of keeping wild animals as pets is not something that's unusual. I mean, if you go, for example, to Amazonia, you find that the people there constantly are catching young animals, bringing them home, and then these pets are essentially reared in the community and kept until they grow up and wander off or something happens to them. But people are very, very attached to these animals. Now, this woman here has a pet peccary in her canoe. She also has this is a dog here, the rear end of a dog. And this dog is a valuable commodity to this woman because she lends it to hunters and it helps in hunting. But she's apparently much more attached to the pig. These photographs were given to me by an anthropologist working in the Amazon region of Colombia. These are the Barasana Indians. And the Barasana are obsessed with keeping pets. They'll keep even animals as large as tapirs. There's the baby tapir being reared in a hut. The adult tapirs will wander around the village. And it's not as if these animals aren't animals that aren't killed and eaten. They are. So hunters will go out and hunt tapirs, but they won't hunt the pets. They won't kill their pets. They recognize the pet animals, and the pets are exempt from being killed. So there is a long established tradition among hunting and gathering peoples of keeping wild animals as pets. And I think this tradition probably existed around the Mediterranean basin 10,000 years ago or so, when people were just transitioning into agriculture. Mostly they were surviving by hunting and fishing, and I think they were catching wild animals of all kinds. And one of those animals was probably the cat. And once they had the cat in the community, then they started to recognize the advantages in terms of somebody who could control the incursions of rodents. So probably most people associate cats with Egypt to some extent. Certainly there are lots and lots of very famous cat images from Egypt. Question is why Egypt was so important for cats. We certainly know that Egypt was an agrarian civilization. They were growing corn, grain, and presumably storing that grain. And wherever you've got stored grain, you're going to get rodents. And in fact, we have a little, in the corner here, a little piece of papyrus showing a sort of an encounter between a cat and a very large rodent here. So it seems likely that the Egyptians would appreciate the activities of cats. By about 1200 BCE, before the current era, it was clear that people were keeping cats in their homes, or at least the Egyptian aristocracy were. So we have many, many images of cats. Usually the artistic convention was to put the cat underneath somebody's chair. Again, the Egyptians were obsessed with animals. They kept pets in their houses, as we see here, of different types. And the cat sort of fitted very nicely into that situation. Another image that's come down to us is the image of the pharaoh and his family down in the marshes, and here we have a cat hunting. Now, it may be that that's just part of the marsh scene, but some people have suggested that the cat was actually being used by the pharaoh and his family to help with these hunting efforts. The Egyptian scholar Jeremy Malek thinks that's probably not the case, that they didn't use cats for hunting. That just shows a detail, a beautiful detail of the cat here. He thinks this was just to do with artistic conventions of the period. In other words, if you were going to depict the pharaoh and his family hunting in the marshes, you would depict every member of the family, and that would include the cat, because the cat was, at that time, considered an important member of the family. Cats also had a very significant role in Egyptian religion. In the early stages, the principal images of cats, religious images of cats, involved the cat as a symbol or a manifestation of the sun god Ra, who was always depicted decapitating this serpent, who is Apophis, who's the serpent of darkness. So the sun god Ra every day is decapitating the serpent of darkness, and so the day comes, the sun comes up. And that was a common image that was seen. Most of these images are fairly early, so this one's from about 3,000 years ago, this one a little bit earlier. What's interesting is all these cats have very long ears for cats, for domestic cats. And now the theory is that this is probably a representation of the serval, which is a separate species, Leptolurus serval, which may have been particularly sacred to the sun god for whatever reason. Now, most of you have probably heard of Bast or Bastet, the cat goddess of Egypt. It's actually a goddess without a name, because Bastet just means she of the city of Bubastis. Bubastis was a city on the Nile Delta here. The Egyptian culture was stretched out along the Nile floodplain, and Bubastis was a very important cultural center up there in the north of Egypt. The goddess herself was a curious kind of hybrid. The earliest cat representations among Egyptian gods was the goddess Sekhmet. She was literally meant the powerful one. She was a kind of a warrior goddess, quite fierce, with a female body, human female body, and a lioness's head. There was another contemporary goddess at the time called Taweret, who was called the Great Female One, and she was a kind of goddess of pregnancy, and was represented as a hippopotamus. Or a sort of pregnant hippopotamus. I'm not sure a lot of pregnant women would appreciate being linked to a pregnant hippopotamus, but there we go. Anyway, at some point, these two goddesses were kind of merged to create Bastet, and this is a very early image of Bastet so some of the earliest versions go back over 4,000 years. And here it's quite clear she has the bottom half of Taweret, the pregnant hippo, and the top half of Sekhmet, the lioness. And that, over time, evolved into this. So by about 1000 BC, we start to see the typical Bastet image, which is the cat-headed goddess with her kittens carrying a sistrum, or a rattle, which was a sacred symbol. And by this time, she's come to symbolize not only pregnancy, but also motherhood, femininity, fertility, a sort of a supremely female goddess, embodying all the characteristics of women of different stages of the life cycle. And that's a kind of late image from about 900 BCE, when the cult of Bastet really started to take off in Egypt. At this point, we know that the Egyptians were really very obsessed with cats. Apparently, most people kept cats in their homes, and if a cat died, the whole family had to go into mourning, and they would express that mourning by shaving off their eyebrows, which is an interesting way of expressing your grief. And it was very dangerous to harm a cat. Anybody who was seen or known to harm a cat was often lynched by mobs. And when the Persians actually invaded Egypt, they exploited this phenomenal attitude to cats by throwing dead cats at the Egyptians. And as a result, the Egyptians were so demoralized that they lost the battle. And this is a sort of artistic reconstruction of the events of 525 BCE when Cambyses and the Persians galloped past hurling dead cats at the Egyptians, and the Egyptians, you can see, are going, oh my God, and fleeing. This is all that remains of the Temple of Bastet now, just a jumble of ruins. But we know from an account given by Herodotus, written about 450 BCE, this was really a very important shrine. So he describes that, and Herodotus was remarkably accurate in his descriptions. We know that he took a lot of pains to describe things as they were. And he's describing this temple as having an entrance 60 feet high, decorated with striking figures 9 feet high, a shrine in the middle of the city, and surrounded by embankments, huge trees, groves of trees. The central part, the square of the temple, is a furlong square. A furlong is about as long as a football field. So that's a huge square there. There's a giant stone image in the middle of the square, but we don't know what the stone image was. We must assume it was probably an image of the goddess, and so on. So clearly this was a very significant cult center. We know something also about the festival of Bastet because Herodotus described it. He said some of the women have rattles and rattle them. Others play the flute through the entire trip. These are people performing a pilgrimage up the Nile, or down the Nile, I should say. Up, sort of north-south, but down the river, to get to Bubastis. So they're on boats, and they're playing flutes, and they're rattling rattles, and the remainder of the women and men sing and clap their hands, and as they travel on towards Bubastis and come near some other city, they edge the boat near the bank, and some of the women do as I have described, but others of them scream obscenities in derision of the women who live in that city, and others of them set to dancing, and others still standing up throw their clothes open to show their nakedness. This they do at every city along the riverbank, and when they come to Bubastis, they celebrate the festival with great sacrifices, and more wine is drunk at that single festival than in all the rest of the year besides. So you can understand why it was a popular festival. And it was a huge festival. Thousands and thousands of people every year made this pilgrimage to Bubastis to participate. When they got there, many of them tried to bury cats, so they would wrap cats in linen, create little cat mummies like this one, and have them embalmed and buried in these sort of giant cat repositories. This is the remains of one of those repositories. Each of these little chambers in the sandstone contained a mummy originally of a cat. Now, some of these have been dug up with literally hundreds of thousands of cat mummies in them. This is an account from Diodorus of Sicily, who visited Bubastis in 59 BCE. This is getting towards the end of the Egyptian Empire. Again, he talks about if anyone is actually seen to be cruel to a cat or to kill a cat, he's likely to meet with a very swift end because the crowds will lynch him. And that Diodorus actually gives an account of a Roman centurion who makes the mistake of killing a cat. And before anybody could stop it happening, the crowd had set upon him and lynched him, and caused a kind of diplomatic incident between Rome and Egypt at that time. The other intriguing thing is that archaeologists have examined these cat remains, these mummified cat remains, and what they find is that in the vast majority of cases, The animals are less than 12 months old, and nearly all of them have died by having their necks dislocated. So they've been subject to cervical dislocation. And again, Jeremy O'Malley explains this in a rather opaque way, but he said, pilgrims who visited temples during annual religious festivals may have wished to pay for the mummification and burial of a cat as a visible expression of piety. Deaths from natural causes would have been fairly evenly distributed throughout the year, and so a certain degree of adroit but confidential management would have been required to ensure that pious Egyptians were not disappointed. In other words, the priesthood around these temples were essentially farming cats and killing them when needed to provide this demand for votive offerings for the goddess, because they would never have been able to supply the demand just by the natural life and death cycle of cats. So a sort of early case of sort of kitten farming, if you like. The Egyptians were very jealous about their cats and did try and stop them leaving Egypt. So people were caught trying to export cats. They could also be put to death. But cats did eventually get out of Egypt and spread around the rest of the Mediterranean. But at that time, they were really viewed as kind of exotic pets. They weren't, their sort of value in terms of keeping rodents down didn't seem to be recognized. The Greeks, for example, used polecats, ferrets, to control rodents rather than cats. This is an early image of a cat from Greece on a marble frieze, but dating from about 500 BCE. And it's a rather nice little incident. Is these two guys with a cat on a leash and another two guys with a dog on a leash, and they're introducing them. It's pretty clear what's going to happen to the dog's nose in about a minute. But it's a nice image. This is another one from an attic vase from Greece, a bit later, showing this woman teasing a cat with a bird. I don't know if it's a live bird or a dead bird, but anyway, the cat's going to have a go at it. This is much later, from about 100 AD in Rome, showing a cat, again, with its arm around a bird from a floor mosaic. Very beautiful image. So cats were quite slow to expand out of the Mediterranean region, but they did eventually. By the Middle Ages, things started to change a lot for cats. So they had spread by this point all over Europe, Northern Europe, and Western Europe. And certainly their value as a source of rodent control was recognized, just shows from this sort of illuminated manuscript from the Middle Ages showing the cats here. The first one's got a mouse in his claws here, and a rat here shown stealing something, I'm not quite sure. But it was also during the Middle Ages that organized persecution of cats started to occur. And it's not entirely clear what was going on here, but for some reason the cat came to be a symbol of the devil, of evil, and this mass persecution of cats took place in many, many towns and cities around Europe. It involved the most appalling kind of cruelties to cats. Cats were thrown on bonfires, cats were thrown off the top of tall buildings. People rounded up cats and suspended them in wicker baskets and then lit fires underneath them. It was a horrific kind of persecution. I put this here because it's an illustration of this, one of these surviving cat festivals from the city of Ypres or Lepe in Belgium. And it's just called the Cat Festival. It occurs every year. And people parade around in the streets dressed up as cats, so they have these giant cat images and mother cat with the baby cats, rather like that image of Bastet earlier, I always think, with the big giant mother cat image with the little babies around her feet. But what's interesting is that the original festival, the medieval festival in Lepe, actually involved everybody in the town rounding up cats, climbing to the top of a tall building and throwing the cats off the top of the tall building. So this was a festival that involved driving out the devil by killing cats, essentially. Now it's just become a sort of an opportunity for people to get together and drink a lot. but it still survives. And also, in the Middle Ages, we see this developing association between cats and witchcraft. These are just some early woodcuts from England, and this is some evidence presented at a trial of a witch called Ursula Kemp in about 1570 something. Her son is giving evidence against her, and he says that his mother, Ursula Kemp, alias Gray, has 4 several spirits, one called Tiffin, the other called Titty, the third Piggin, and the fourth Jack, and being asked what colors they were, saith that Titty is like a little grey cat, Tiffin is like a white lamb, Piggin is black like a toad, and Jack is black like a cat. And he saith that he hath seen his mother at times to give them beer to drink, and of a white loaf or cake to eat, and saith that in the night time the said spirits will come to his mother and suck blood of her upon her arms and other parts of her body. Well, if it wasn't for the bit about blood-sucking, this would be a kind of description of an older woman with her pets, really. And this is sort of what it looks like here. It's a woman feeding her cat. There's some couple of toads or frogs in the box behind the cat. These are another couple of very famous witches called Margaret and Philippa Flower, who in the 1580s were arraigned for witchcraft. They actually were servants in the house of the Duke of Rutland, and his family suffered a lot of personal tragedies, and eventually the finger was pointed at these 2 servants who it was claimed were witches. But again, we see always the image of the cat there. The cat's hiding back here, but there's also a rat or something here, and there's an owl on the shoulder, and there's a dog in the background. So it wasn't exclusively cats, but cats seem to always be present whenever people started talking about this association between witches and their animal spirits or their animal familiars. The situation was a bit different on the continent. For example, this is an early illustration by Hans Baldung Green from 1514, depicting supposedly a witch's Sabbath. And here we have a group of witches gathered together creating weather magic. So this is sort of weather coming out here. There's another witch riding backwards on a goat, flying goat here. And then just down here in the corner is the cat. On the continent of Europe, as opposed to Britain, England, this kind of conception of witchcraft was very typical as kind of orgiastic, a gathering, a sort of secret ceremony, magic being created, and people being turned into animals. And this may be a representation of a witch who has turned herself into a cat, because as a cat she could move about through the community at night unnoticed and sort of cause harm to people or livestock or whatever. And the interesting thing about these European ideas of witchcraft is that it came out through ecclesiastical trials. So it was the church predominantly taking these people to court, frequently torturing them, and extorting these kinds of confessions that were very extravagant kind of confessions. In England, it was a different situation. People were tried in civil court. There was no church involvement. There was no torture as such, although people were deprived of sleep and things like that. And a very different kind of view came out of just occasionally small groups of women, but usually just solitary women with their familiars, their imps. And these imps were usually represented as small animals. In this case, there's an imp here called Holt, who is a cat. That you can see the witch is saying the cat's name here in this kind of voice box here. And this one's saying, my imps' names are Illy Mauser and Piewacket. And this is a dog familiar called Jarmara. And this is a rabbit familiar called Sack and Sugar, and so on. This is all taken from the frontispiece of a book, a pamphlet by somebody called Matthew Hopkins, who at that time was a witch finder. He was kind of self-appointed. He went around the country and said, I'll find any witches in your neighborhood, just give me the permission. So he'd go and pick up rumors, gossip, and eventually imprison some poor old lady in a room and deprive her of sleep until she confessed to being a witch. And he was very successful. He made a lot of money doing this. These are just some other slightly later European versions. These again depict, this is one's called The Witch's Kitchen by Jacob de Haan, a Dutch illustrator. And you can see there's a cat. The cat is just there in the middle of the picture at the witch's feet. In the lower one, again, there's a cat here with its back. And this is an illustration from Francisco de Goya from Spain. This is a female witch applying flying ointment to a male witch. And you can see he's kind of levitating off the ground. But here in the foreground again is the cat. A couple of cats, actually. So there was this very, very strong association between cats and witchcraft. And then finally, this is a very strange little satirical image by the British illustrator William Hogarth from the mid-18th century. It's actually from a diatribe against kind of fire and brimstone preachers. It's got this strange image of the preacher with this little kind of puppet witch on a piece of string dangling down. It's the classic witch now riding a broomstick, the witch we associate with the kind of Halloween witch now. But what's really weird is that the witch is actually nursing a cat. So the cat's sitting at the front of the broomstick and nursing from the witch. Some years ago, for my pains, I decided to do an analysis of all these witch trial accounts, the original accounts from this period, which in England stretched from about 1570 through till 1713, when the last person was finally, actually she was released from prison, having been accused of witchcraft. And I just analyzed all the dogs, all the animals that were cited as familiars in that, all those trial accounts. There were like some 340-something trial accounts. And I had to split them up between the Matthew Hopkins trials and the other trials, because Matthew Hopkins' trials were in a category all of their own. He made up all kinds of weird evidence. But anyway, you can see the largest category of animals are simply not described. So they just say the witch had a familiar. They don't describe it at all. But the second largest category was, in fact, the cat. And especially among the non-Hopkins trials. Hopkins preferred mice, because you can always find a mouse somewhere in a house. And so, oh, there was a mouse. Oh, she must be a witch. So I sometimes wonder if these early witches weren't, in fact, just sort of early versions of animal hoarders. Certainly when we look at the profile of the typical animal hoarder these days, they are predominantly women. They're predominantly middle-aged or older. They're predominantly low income. They tend to be socially isolated and overwhelmed by the circumstances of their lives. And they often have obsessive or delusional personality disorders of one sort or another. And that is very often a description that fits, it seems, some of these early cases of women who found themselves in court being charged with witchcraft. They seem to have had animals in the house. Sometimes they seem to have had quite a lot of them. And they were often already regarded as being peculiar in some way. So they were socially isolated. Many of them had, it sounds like they had Tourette's syndrome or something. They would curse people in the street for no apparent reason, and people would get upset by this. So when the witch finder came to town, they'd say, oh, yeah, well, Mary down the street, she's a crazy old thing. She's got a house full of cats, and she's probably a witch. It was also around this period that people seemed to first recognize cats as a potential source of allergies and asthma. This is a nice quote from Edward Topsell, a natural historian living in the 17th century, who said that cats consume the radical humor and destroy the lungs, and therefore they which keep their cats with them in their beds have the air corrupted and fall into several hectics and consumptions. There's an archaic way of describing a sort of allergy attack or an asthma attack caused by cats. So I guess one very obvious question is, why did we get this sort of dramatic shift in attitudes to cats? You know, we start off with this idea of a cat as a sacred symbol of femininity, of fertility, of motherhood, good things. And then it shifts to this kind of idea of the cat as a demonic companion of a witch, or as the devil incarnate, really. What on earth could trigger that kind of fundamental shift in public attitudes to a single animal? I don't think we have an answer to that, but I think there might have been several things going on. One of those things essentially involved politics. The Christian church at that time, in the sort of Middle Ages, was making very deliberate and conscious efforts to suppress earlier pagan religions that were presumably surviving around Europe. And it may be that cat simply got caught up in that, became a kind of scapegoat because of its earlier associations with, say, fertility cults, that kind of thing. I think there was a powerful element of misogyny in the persecution of cats. The cat had this symbolic association with what you might call unbridled femininity, and that this was sort of profoundly antithetical to the sort of patriarchal institutions of the day in the Middle Ages and early modern period in Europe. And people were very uncomfortable with that association and so tended to persecute cats. And then finally, there's a kind of psychological anxiety, which I attribute to the cat's kind of slightly uncanny ability to move easily between culture and nature, between the domestic condition and the wild condition. I mean, we talk about domestic cats, but in some ways cats are never fully domesticated. They always have this ability to drift back into a feral state, given the opportunity. And it continues to happen all over the world, where people have taken cats into new areas. The cats kind of drift out into the natural setting again. And I think this kind of represented a serious challenge to the moral order during this early period of history, when people were still kind of trying to define themselves as being civilized and, you know, apart from wild nature and savagery. And they were uncomfortable, I think, at some level with having an animal that could transition between the two so readily. And I think really what we're talking about is a combination of all three. So I see the cat really as a sort of victim of prejudice, and this comes out nicely in a quote from Louis Le Comte de Buffon, one of the great naturalists of France in the late 18th century, who wrote about different animals. He said about cats, he said, "Though these animals, when young, are frolicsome and beautiful, they possess at the same time an innate malice and perverse disposition which increases as they grow up and which education learns them to conceal but not to subdue. They easily assume the habits of society but never acquire its manners, for they have only the appearance of attachment or friendship." Again, harking back to that self-interested kind of view of cats, that they're just really in it for the food and the warmth. And then he goes on, this is where the female aspect comes in. He says, "What is singular in the animal world, the female cat seems to be more ardent than the male. She is not only invites and goes in quest of him, but announces by loud cries the fury of her passion, or rather the pressure of her necessities. And when the male disdains her or flies from her, she pursues and tears, and though their embraces are always accompanied with the most acute pain, compels him to comply with her desires." So again, this is like this misogynistic view of cats as these kind of rapacious females who are out to get men. It's very interesting. Just to put it in perspective, Europe wasn't the only place where cats were regarded ambivalently. In Japan, there are lots of myths about spectral vampire cats, and these cats are always represented having multiple tails. Interesting, there was a tradition in Japan of cutting off kittens' tails when they were born, sort of docking cats' tails, just to prevent this happening, to prevent the cat turning into a kind of malevolent demon cat. There's another example. The cat's walking on hind legs, and they've got two tails here. And I wonder to what extent that might also explain the evolution of this sort of genetically unique, the Japanese bobtail cat, whether they actually bred for a cat that lacked a full tail. because they were concerned about this association. Now, of course, things have changed in Japan. Cats, by and large, have a very positive image. This is the famous maneki neko, a good luck sign. You'll see it in every Japanese storefront, a cat waving to you as you come in. In Europe, cats sort of made their comeback really during the 18th century. While there was still a lot of prejudice around, what we see in this 18th century appearance is an emergence of a kind of a middle class, essentially, with money and time. And the middle classes started keeping pets a lot, and cats were included here. So we can see the little cat dancing on the table, or being danced on the table, and the little cat here at the fish market coming in. And now, of course, you know, the cat has become the darling of YouTube and Tumblr. You know, if you really want to be entertained, just go to YouTube and put in funny cat videos, and you will get this incredible onslaught of amusing, cute, wonderful images of cats. So the cat really has been completely transformed back. You know, we haven't quite got to the point yet of worshipping cats again, but certainly the pendulum has swung back for cats, and they've become extremely popular, and people really, you know, have carved out a place for cats in their domestic lives that would be the envy of many animals, I think. And I think that's probably a good place for me to stop. Thank you.